The 2024 trade deadline needs to be a big one for the Seattle Mariners. They have their biggest lead on the division since 2001, and they have a really good chance with this pitching staff to go further. But obviously, they have a lot of needs for this team, so we asked you guys what you think the Mariners need to do the most. And this mega thread that we have of polls for the MLB trade deadline resulted in some interesting things and some things that I didn't really expect out of the Mariners fan base, because obviously there are a lot of different takes on what the Mariners should do at the trade deadline, but a lot of people seem to agree on a certain few things. So let's take a look at the first one here. Starting here with what is the Mariners' biggest need? Now, 81 votes, there's still 2 hours left, but I think it's pretty safe to say that outfield is the biggest need for the Seattle Mariners according to the community. 66.7% of people said outfield, and then 22.2% of people said relief pitching. So if I had to guess, I'd say they would want an outfielder and a relief pitcher. They're going to need to make multiple moves, but outfield seems to be the biggest need for them. And the good news is there are a lot of outfielders on the market right now that you could go out and get. There's Starling Marte, of course the big ones like Luis Robert, even Kyle Tucker if you think that's an option, Taylor Ward, etc. So everybody wants to add an outfield bat, but at the same time there are a lot of big bats that are not necessarily outfielders that are available on this market, including guys like Vlad Jr. and Bo Bichette. Along with Luis Robert, who did you guys say is the most important to add out of those three? According to this poll, yes, Luis Robert takes over Vlad Jr. and Bo Bichette, who both had 15.9% of the vote. They had Luis Robert at 45.1% of who they would want the most at this trade deadline. Also, a lot of people voted for other here at 23.2%. I felt like I should just add other. I was hoping people would kind of give me ideas of who that might be. I mean, guys like Brian De La Cruz, obviously, again, people are talking about Taylor Ward, etc. But I think the three biggest ones here are Vlad Jr., Luis Robert, and Bo Bichette. And of those three, people want Luis Robert more than anything. With that being said, however, I do think the Mariners do need to add more than just one bat. And yeah, it looks like you guys do too. How many bats should the Mariners add? An overwhelming majority at 77.8% said that they need to add 2 bats. Now, interestingly enough, the second highest vote getting here was 3 bats at 9.9%. Now, obviously, the bats don't have to be in a specific spot. Like, you don't necessarily have to go out there and add a first baseman at the trade deadline in terms of like Vlad Jr. But we agree that it should be an outfielder as one of the bats. The other one, I mean, honestly, you could add a second outfielder and just add 2 of them. Also, maybe an infield guy that could take over at second base if Jorge Polanco just isn't that guy moving forward, and someone that you could maybe even switch over to DH. So in terms of 1 to 2 to 3 bats here, I'm not exactly sure what those moves would be. At least 1 bat in the outfield, and I think a quality infielder, a guy that's having a decent year, would make a lot of sense as well. We're going to go over a couple of them here. The Mariners have a payroll of around $140 million. Will they add a player making $15 million at the deadline? And 63.3% of you guys said yes. Now, I think that I worded this a little bit poorly. I should have worded it as like, will they add $15 million to payroll? I think that would have made a little bit more sense, because there's only a few guys that are actually making over $15 million. So that's my bad. But at least 63% of you guys are saying that the Mariners will add at least $15 million worth of payroll at this trade deadline, which I think is a good sign. I mean, obviously we heard from an article from like Ken Rosenthal that the Mariners will be aggressive and that the financials are not the problem at this trade deadline. We also heard that from John Stanton. Obviously, it's kind of wait and see here. But the thing is with this front office, how do we feel about them making these trades? And for the most part, everybody trusts this front office to make trades at 74.7%. They all think that this front office can make the trades necessary to drive this team to the postseason. However, do we trust ownership to give the financial flexibility? 88.5% of people put no, which I think is the right move here, because obviously we all know that John Stanton is not quite the guy to give you a lot of financial flexibility at the trade deadline. We saw this in the offseason, so I'm honestly surprised that this wasn't 100% no. Maybe John Stanton has a bunch of burner accounts, and that's what accounted for this like 11.5%. Let's get into some prospect talk here. I asked the community, are you willing to part with multiple top 10 prospects in a trade? And 90.8% of people said yes, which I find fascinating. Obviously, it depends on the deal that you're trading these guys in, but the Mariners have a really, really bright future with a lot of their top 10 prospects as early as next year. And I think that when you look at guys like Colt Emerson, Lazaro Montes, Harry Ford, Cole Young, it'd be tough to see those guys go. It really would. But at the same time, you have to be able to go out there and, in the right package, make those moves to bring in the bat that you need to go to the World Series this year. So I think the community is spot on here with the multiple top 10 prospects. When it comes to the top 4 prospects in the Mariners system, Harry Ford is the one that the people are most okay with giving up at 57.5%. Interestingly enough, Colt Emerson, who I think is the future consensus #1 in this prospect ranking system because he's just been so good but he's still so young, is the guy they're least willing to give up. Cole Young here at 27.5%. So the Mariners 1 and 2 prospects account for about 80% of the prospects that the fan base is willing to give up, which I find very interesting. And yeah, that kind of tracks here with the most untouchable prospects that I have here. Lazaro Montes at 39.8% and Colt Emerson at nearly 50%. And I think that these two guys specifically, the 3 and the 4 in the Mariners system, these are the guys the Mariners fans are really counting on for the future. But they're okay with giving up guys that are close to the big leagues right now if it means they go out there and add to this team to help them make the World Series this year. So Colt Emerson seems to be a fan favorite here. And Lazaro Montes, you guys know he's my favorite guy. And he is up here around 40% as well. So yeah, I'd put him as untouchable. Now, untouchable is obviously a very strong term. Like, nobody is untouchable for the right price. It's just that right price probably isn't going to happen for guys like Colt Emerson and Lazaro Montes, at least in the fan base's mind. Like, yeah, if the Dodgers come at you and say, hey, we'll give you Shohei Ohtani for Lazaro Montes, you're doing it. Like, duh, you're absolutely doing it. But if it's in a deal for Luis Robert Jr., the fan base looks like they're more willing to give up Cole Young than they are Colt Emerson in that deal. So the #1 prospect instead of the #3 prospect. So it's just interesting to see where the fan base's minds are at. And I don't disagree with it. I do think that Emerson is going to be the better prospect in the long run. So yeah, I kind of like where you guys' head's at. And guys that are still currently prospects but have been at the big league level, of which young player are you willing to part with most? 80% of people said Jonathan Clase over Tyler Locklear and Ryan Bliss. So obviously we've seen Clase in the big leagues a little bit. He hasn't had a ton of time, a ton of run. But Jonathan Clase has been in the big leagues. And from what the fan base has seen, at least the people that we polled, from what they saw, they would be more willing to give up Jonathan Clase than Bliss or Locklear right now. And I know, at least for Joe and I specifically, we have given up Clase in a lot of our trade ideas. So maybe that's kind of pushed the people in that direction as well. I do like Jonathan Clase. I think that he has a really good chance to be at least a definite contributor on this team in the future. But Bliss and Locklear, I think, just play more premium positions, so they're a little bit more important. So from the big group of guys we asked earlier, it was Luis Robert that everybody wanted more than anybody else, including Vlad and Bo Bichette. But now we're talking about relievers. Who would you rather have for the cost? And 48.8% of people said Tanner Scott of the Miami Marlins. Now, we've seen all of these guys this year, although I guess we don't really know who other is here. The 7.3% of people voted for. But Austin Adams with the Athletics is a guy who was obviously a former Mariner. Only 18.3% of the vote here. I think he would be the cheapest of them all. Michael Kopech at 25.6% of the vote. I think he'd be the second cheapest, and Tanner Scott would be the most expensive. So I think in the way that fans voted here, it makes the most sense that Tanner Scott is at the highest because he has the highest ceiling in my opinion. Although Kopech's potential is one that I feel like has never really been reached. Austin Adams, I mean, he's just had a good year. Same question here with Brian De La Cruz, Brent Rooker, Starling Marte, and other. And this one surprised me a little bit. 64% of the people voted for Brent Rooker, an outfielder for the Athletics here, who is not a great outfielder. He's not all that good defensively at all, and he's really more of a DH type. They voted for him over Starling Marte and Brian De La Cruz. Marte's a bit older towards the tail end of his career, and De La Cruz has had one good year but has a really good potential, but Rooker's a guy who just has continuously hit. Now, personally, I think this is the one that I disagree with the most. I think of those three, Rooker's the guy that I want the least. And with that being said, again, he has put up really good numbers over the past few years and likes to hit in T-Mobile Park. So maybe I'm wrong here, and I accept that. Marte's a guy where you'd be adding quite a bit of salary, although maybe the Mets would be willing to eat it to get some decent prospects back. Brian De La Cruz is a guy who we have seen with the Miami Marlins kind of torch the Mariners a little bit recently, so maybe there's some recency bias there, but I think that I would probably go Marte, then De La Cruz, then Brent Rooker, because Starling Marte throughout the entirety of his career has done this, whereas Rooker seems like a prime regression target if he was to come to T-Mobile Park. Again, I could be very wrong on this, just in terms of how much it would cost, depending on if the Mets are willing to eat some of Marte's salary, would kind of change the cost there. Rooker, I feel like, is going to actually cost you quite a bit because I don't think the Athletics want to trade him within their division right now, and Brian De La Cruz is a guy who's still got 3.5 years left of control. I think that he has really good potential, but has not found it yet with the Miami Marlins. Now, a real basic question here. Will the Mariners make this team better at the trade deadline? 86.2% of you guys said yes. So we're all in agreement that the Mariners are going to go out there and make a big move at the deadline, one that will make this team better. So that's a good sign, I think, because obviously in years past, we've seen them trade their closer, what have you. I think this is a really good sign as Mariners fans that we're all kind of in the same boat, that this is the year they're going to go out there and add to this team. I also asked, if the Mariners add one of Robert, Vlad, Bichette, or Alonso, do they win the AL West? And 95% of you guys said that they would. If they added one of these big four, the Mariners would win the American League West. Now, what I should have also done in these polls is ask the exact opposite. If the Mariners don't add one of these big four, do they win the American League West? I should have asked that, and I feel like the answer would have been a lot different. Because do I think that they need to add one of these big four to win the West? No, I don't. But I do feel like, obviously, they're the easiest answers to help. And when you look at the guys at this trade deadline, again, Brian De La Cruz, Starling Marte, Brent Rooker, etc., guys like that make sense to add to this team, but maybe aren't huge impact makers like these big four guys are. Yeah, I can definitely see why the fan base would rather have one of the big four than they would a Brent Rooker, for example. But in terms of the cost and what it's going to take to get them, I don't necessarily know if it's frugal enough for them to go out and add those kind of bats, when in the end they might win the AL West anyway. Now, the most important poll I had was, should the Mariners sign Daniel Vogelbach? And 100% of you guys said yes, so you guys are smart. Well done. Well done. So while I don't think the Mariners have to go out there and add one of the big four in Robert, Bichette, Vlad, or Alonso, they do need to add. And in my opinion, they need to do it now. They need to start adding at this very moment. And I talked about this in this video right here on the screen now. Go ahead and check that one out. I appreciate you guys watching this one, and go Mariners.